It started as an ordinary night in the small desert town of Arroyo Ridge, a place where the wind always whispered through the dry scrub and the stars usually stretched endlessly above, familiar and calm. People had no reason to worry, no reason to look up from their late dinners or the flicker of TV screens. But that night, the sky betrayed them in a way no one could have anticipated. Around 11:47 p.m., the first anomaly appeared, a faint ripple across the heavens, like a dark curtain being drawn aside, only to reveal something deeper, colder, and more alien than the void of space itself. Residents who glanced outside at first dismissed it as a cloud, a trick of moonlight on the horizon, but within minutes, the entire sky seemed to shiver, shifting in unnatural patterns, shadows moving faster than light, shapes forming and disappearing before any human eye could process them fully. Phones died in pockets, digital clocks froze at the same impossible moment, streetlights flickered violently, and a low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the town. It was not just noise. It was a frequency that penetrated the bones, vibrating in sync with heartbeats, forcing terror into every living being without warning. Livestock began to panic. Horses screamed in stalls, goats broke free from pens, dogs barked incessantly, but not at any visible threat. Something unseen was present, invisible yet undeniably there, a presence that warped the very fabric of perception. Those who stepped outside reported seeing shapes descend from the sky, elongated forms that bent at impossible angles, floating with no visible propulsion, their skin reflecting none of the moonlight, their faces featureless but for dark, empty eyes that seemed to pierce directly into the observer's mind, reading and replaying memories at will. One man, a local rancher named Paul Hendricks, tried to run but froze, mesmerized as the shapes hovered silently above his property, scanning, calculating, learning. By midnight, a series of strange scorch marks appeared in the sand, circles and symbols burned into the earth with a precision no human could achieve. Thermal cameras set up by a visiting journalist showed strange entities drifting above the town, their heat signatures inconsistent, flickering in ways that defied physics. One camera even captured a reflection of the operator himself, mimicking movements he had not made, smiling in a way he never smiled, as though someone, or something, was practicing being human. Children awoke screaming. Pets disappeared. Vehículos tallet inexplicably. Even those safely indoors could feel it. The sensation of being observed, measured, dissected, a fear so profound it left no room for rational thought. Radios and televisions burst into static, transmitting distorted voices repeating names of people who were inside their homes, uttering intimate secrets that no stranger could possibly know. And then, as the clock approached 2:17 a.m., the sky itself opened wider, a vast black hole blotting out the stars, expanding downward until it seemed to touch the rooftops, stretching its cold emptiness toward the streets and yards, pulling shadows from their hiding places and distorting the familiar landscape into something alien, unrecognizable, terrifying. The residents of Arroyo Ridge were no longer just in a desert town. They were inside something vast and incomprehensible, a stage for entities whose motives were unknowable, whose power was absolute, whose patience was infinite. That first night was only the beginning, the opening act of a terror that would stretch over hours, days, weeks, and ultimately reshape the boundaries of reality for every living soul who dared to witness it. And for those who thought they had slept peacefully that night, the sky had left an imprint so deep in their subconscious that even daylight could not erase it, a memory that would return in shadows, in reflections, in the faint hum of the wind through the canyon, reminding them always. The sky had opened, and what came through was no longer bound by human law or human logic. By the time the clock struck 2:17 a.m., the entire town of Arroyo Ridge had descended into a surreal nightmare that no one could have imagined. Windows rattled with the vibrations of a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the sky itself, penetrating walls, floors, and even human flesh, resonating directly with the deepest fears of those inside. Streets were littered with the abandoned vehicles of those who had tried to flee, but found themselves inexplicably returned to the same intersection, as if the road had shifted and looped back on itself under some impossible force. From the shadows along the canyons, shapes began to emerge, elongated, moving without touching the ground, bending in ways that made no sense, yet somehow perfectly fluid, gliding silently over sand, asphalt, and grass. Some residents reported seeing doors and windows open on their own, lights flicker on and off, as if the town itself had become a living organism responding to an alien intelligence. Paul Hendricks, the rancher, tried to gather his livestock but froze again as he watched the shapes approach. Figures that resembled humans at a distance, but whose proportions betrayed a grotesque imitation. Arms too long, heads tilting at impossible angles, mouths forming wide, jagged smiles that seemed to ripple and shift. When they hovered near, their presence induced a paralysis in the mind, a disorientation that made every attempt to act or think rationally impossible. Electronics failed. Phones displayed only static. Cameras malfunctioned, capturing ghostly echoes of previous moments, images that seemed alive and moving independently, sometimes showing people who were not present, sometimes showing versions of themselves that were wrong, smiling incorrectly, blinking at. Impossible intervalle. Several witnesses described a phenomenon where voices echoed, speaking intimate details or repeating words they had never said aloud. One teenager, Emma, reported hearing her mother's voice calling her name from the empty desert, only to find herself alone, the voice echoing from nowhere, chillingly accurate, reading her thoughts before she could think them. At the same time, thermographic footage revealed impossible phenomena, silhouettes floating above the desert, limbs bending in impossible ways, shadows detaching themselves from bodies to drift independently, twisting through the air with intelligence and purpose. Attempts to flee were futile. The town itself had become a trap. Roads shifted, distances compressed or expanded, and time seemed inconsistent. Minutes could stretch into hours, hours into moments. Those who had cameras or smartphones caught glimpses of beings that defied physics, their bodies elongated, faces smooth yet expressive in impossible ways, black eyes reflecting no light, only absorbing it, drawing the observer into a silent void. By the end of the first night, the residents of Arroyo Ridge who had survived were physically intact, but irreversibly altered psychologically. Sleeplessness, night terrors, paranoia, and visions of the beings persisted relentlessly. Some began to vanish entirely. First a dog, then livestock, then entire families, leaving behind only faint scorch marks, twisted sand patterns, or the faintest echo of sound captured on malfunctioning devices. The night ended as suddenly as it had begun. The sky closed back into a dark, seemingly ordinary void. The low hum ceased, and the town was left in eerie stillness, silent except for the occasional whisper of wind. Yet nothing had returned to normal. The residents felt watched, measured, rehearsed. Shadows moved with independent intent, reflections in mirrors and windows no longer. Impossible intervalle. Several witnesses described a phenomenon where voices echoed, speaking intimate details or repeating words they had never said aloud. One teenager, Emma, reported hearing her mother's voice calling her name from the empty desert, only to find herself alone, the voice echoing from nowhere, chillingly accurate, reading her thoughts before she could think them. At the same time, thermographic footage revealed impossible phenomena, silhouettes floating above the desert, limbs bending in impossible ways, shadows detaching themselves from bodies to drift independently, twisting through the air with intelligence and purpose. Attempts to flee were futile. The town itself had become a trap. Roads shifted, distances compressed or expanded, and time seemed inconsistent. Minutes could stretch into hours, hours into moments. Those who had cameras or smartphones caught glimpses of beings that defied physics, their bodies elongated, faces smooth yet expressive in impossible ways, black eyes reflecting no light, only absorbing it, drawing the observer into a silent void. By the end of the first night, the residents of Arroyo Ridge who had survived were physically intact, but irreversibly altered psychologically. Sleeplessness, night terrors, paranoia, and visions of the beings persisted relentlessly. Some began to vanish entirely. First a dog, then livestock, then entire families, leaving behind only faint scorch marks, twisted sand patterns, or the faintest echo of sound captured on malfunctioning devices. The night ended as suddenly as it had begun. The sky closed back into a dark, seemingly ordinary void. The low hum ceased, and the town was left in eerie stillness, silent except for the occasional whisper of wind. Yet nothing had returned to normal. The residents felt watched, measured, rehearsed. Shadows moved with independent intent, reflections in mirrors and windows no longer matched their owners, and objects in their homes sometimes shifted subtly, as if someone unseen was learning how to live among them. When the sun rose, Arroyo Ridge appeared untouched, peaceful even, but the memories of the night persisted, haunting minds, replaying in dreams and waking hallucinations. Those who had witnessed it could not unsee what they had seen, and for some, the creature's influence had already begun to manifest in subtle ways. The way their hands moved, the tilt of their heads, the uncanny way smiles occasionally spread across their faces unbidden. Everyone understood instinctively. Whatever had descended from the sky was still present, still observing, still learning, and the night had not ended. As the nights stretched on after the first terrifying event, Arroyo Ridge began to change in ways that were subtle at first, but increasingly impossible to ignore. Families barricaded themselves in homes, windows covered, lights off, praying the dark figures would not notice them. Yet even in isolation, the hum returned, low and persistent, vibrating in their chests, in their bones, in their skulls. Doors creaked open without wind. Shadows drifted across rooms independently of any source, and the once familiar desert landscape outside their homes twisted into something alien, as if reality itself had been rewritten. Paul Hendricks, the rancher, returned to check his property one night and discovered his animals had been replaced with shapes. Elongated, featureless, unblinking eyes staring from twisted, humanoid forms that were neither alive nor entirely absent. Those who dared step outside reported encountering the beings directly. They hovered silently over roads, sometimes imitating people they had observed earlier, copying gestures, postures, even clothing. One young man, named Javier, approached a figure that seemed to be a reflection of his own brother, only to find its mouth widening unnaturally as it repeated every intimate word Javier had ever spoken, twisting them into a distorted parody of speech, forcing a terror so deep he fell to the ground screaming. Residents discovered that even attempts to communicate with authorities were futile. Phones and radios carried only static or the faintest echo of their own voices, distorted and repeating words that had never been said aloud. Thermal imaging and night vision cameras captured impossible phenomena, silhouettes floating silently above the desert, moving in perfect synchronization, limbs bending and contorting like a physical impossibility, heads tilting in ways no living spine could tolerate, black eyes absorbing light and reflecting a void. Disappearances increased. First livestock, then pets, then families, and finally lone individuals venturing outside. When a search party tried to investigate the outskirts, they found only scorched sand, broken patterns etched in perfect geometry, and echoes of voices calling their names with exact accuracy. Some who returned alive described experiencing time differently, minutes stretching into hours, moments collapsing into instantaneous terror, and a constant sensation of being observed from every angle. Children reported seeing the beings inside their homes, standing silently in corners, mimicking parents' movements, whispering words they could not comprehend, but that resonated with fear. Sleep became impossible for the town. Every night brought hallucinations, whispers, faint touches, shadows that lingered in the corner of vision. People began to change. Not physically, but their movements, their gestures, the tilt of their heads, the way smiles spread across their faces, subtle, uncanny, unnervingly accurate imitations of something else. And then, inexplicably, some residents started to disappear entirely, leaving behind only faint scorch marks in the desert, twisted patterns in the sand, or abandoned belongings that hinted at an unseen presence. By the third night, it was clear the sky had not merely opened. It had released something that was not bound by human logic, not limited by human perception, not constrained by any earthly law. And as the black void stretched above the town, expanding wider with each night, the remaining inhabitants realized a horrifying truth. They were no longer simply witnesses. They were participants being observed, measured, and studied. Their gestures, their thoughts, their very essence were being cataloged, copied, and imitated. Those who survived the nights began noticing subtle duplications of themselves, figures in the periphery that moved exactly as they did, shadows that reflected intentions before they were acted upon. Even in daylight, fear persisted because the sky had opened once, and there was no reason it wouldn't open again. The entities were patient. They were learning. And by the end of each night, Arroyo Ridge felt like a cage, the desert stretching endlessly, the silence oppressive, a reminder that the beings above, and perhaps everywhere, were already inside their minds, already inside their reality, and there was no escape from observation, no escape from replication, no escape from the growing, incomprehensible horror that had arrived from the night sky. By the fourth night, Arroyo Ridge had become a place unrecognizable to those who had once lived there. The streets were eerily silent, punctuated only by the low, resonant hum that seemed to pulse from the sky itself, vibrating through every inch of earth, concrete, and bone. Entire blocks were abandoned, doors hung open, windows shattered, and personal belongings lay scattered as though their owners had simply vanished into the void. Those who remained were constantly aware of the unseen gaze that followed them, a presence that measured, recorded, and mirrored their every movement. From the edges of town, elongated shapes descended once more, floating silently, limbs bending at impossible angles, faces featureless yet undeniably aware, eyes blacker than the absence of stars, absorbing light and intent alike. Attempts to flee were futile, roads twisted unnaturally, paths looped back upon themselves, and familiar landmarks became alien under the shadow of the gaping sky. Families huddled together, whispering prayers, but even these were intercepted. Voices, distorted yet intimate, echoed from every direction, repeating fears, secrets, and regrets in tones only the listener could recognize. One group of survivors attempted to escape in a convoy of vehicles, but as they drove, their reflections in mirrors began to act independently, smiling before they smiled, turning heads before the drivers did, repeating gestures in perfect mimicry, and the vehicles themselves stalled repeatedly in alignment with the figures hovering overhead. By dawn, the full extent of the horror became clear. The sky had not opened merely to observe or collect data. It had opened to replace, to replicate, to insert itself into the very fabric of reality. Shadows of the missing could be seen moving silently through streets and homes, their motions identical to the originals, yet empty of humanity. And then came the whispers, no longer distant. Almost. These repeated endlessly, a mantra that embedded itself in the minds of the terrified survivors, until some could no longer distinguish between themselves and the entities. The remaining inhabitants noticed that even when the sky appeared closed, the same blackness lingered in reflections, in glass, in polished surfaces, and in the periphery of vision. Animals reacted with terror, fleeing or hiding, yet their instincts could not escape the presence either, and their disappearance followed soon after. By the end of the fourth night, Arroyo Ridge ceased to exist as a normal town. It became a testing ground, a living experiment, a stage for the beings that had descended through the ripped sky. The few who survived, if they could still be called survivors, moved like ghosts, their thoughts no longer entirely their own, their gestures subtly wrong, copied, practiced. And as the sun rose, faintly illuminating the desert, there was no relief, only the lingering, undeniable truth. The sky had opened, what came through had learned, and it would not stop until everything that had once been human was replaced by something else, something patient, something unbounded, and something impossibly eternal. From that day forward, whenever the wind swept across the desert, the low hum could be heard faintly, a reminder that the night sky could open again, and when it did, the world would be watched, measured, copied, and transformed forever. And in the minds of the few who remembered, the chilling thought remained. Perhaps the sky had never really closed at all.